quite a few of you. Right, okay. So I'll just tell you a bit about my story, and then I'll have plenty of time for answering questions. And I do recognise some of you here, some of you I've known for a very long time. And so my name's Paula Carnell, and I live in Castle Carey. I've lived there for about 30 years. So my original career was an artist, and I had a gallery in Castle Carey. So I don't know if any of you remember the Posse Gallery in the early 1990s. So that was me. So if you thought I looked a bit familiar and couldn't quite place it, that's what I used to do. So I had a 20-year career as an artist, gallery owner, publisher, had greeting cards, sold them 700 shops around Britain. And then I also exported to 11 countries. So I really enjoyed my business, enjoyed painting. And then when I hit 40 years of age, I completely collapsed. And I ended up spending the next 7 years bed and wheelchair bound with a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So it's apparently genetic. So I was born with it, and it was amazing that I kept upright for 40 years. And as you can see, I'm upright again now. And although I was told I'd never walk again, I wouldn't work again, and I certainly wouldn't paint again, I obviously ignored that recommendation. And through herbal medicine and plant-based minerals, I recovered my health. And so that's how you see me now today. Well, about 2 years into being bedbound, one of the ways I had to cope with my condition was thinking about what I could do rather than what I couldn't do. And we lived just on the outskirts of Castle Carey, sort of Ansford Way, looking out over fields. And I did spend a lot of time in bed looking out the window or laying in the garden on a hammock. And thankfully, we'd had the garden landscaped, so it wasn't too frustrating to lay there not being able to do anything. So my husband, a couple of years in, he built me a beehive. He got a kit, flat pack beehive, and built me a beehive so I could have it in the back garden so that I could lay in bed and watch the bees. And I had a lovely mentor from Castle Carey, Chris Wright, some of you may know. He'd been keeping bees for a long time. And there's a lovely story of how we got to meet. And this is something that those of you who work with bees will probably agree. There's a lot of synchronicity. When you start working with bees, things seem to happen. And I had the hive. My husband was like, why do you want a hive when you haven't got the bees? How can you have bees if you can't look after them? And I just felt if I have the hive, the bees will come. And they did come, and they came with Chris, who happened to be walking around the field behind our house and spotted the beehive. And then when I phoned up on the BBKA, which is the British Beekeeping Association website, for swarm collectors in Castle Carey, Chris's was the number. And when I was describing where I was and what sort of hive he went, he recognised it. And I'd also spotted him as a new dog walker in the field. So it was amazing how we got introduced to each other. So he started put one of his colonies of bees in my hive, and I started watching them. And once a week he would come over, and I'd get out of bed and I'd pretend to be well for an hour or two, and he'd teach me what he knew about beekeeping. And those of you know Chris, he's a very quiet man, very calm. And I wanted to know everything, and I challenged everything. So I probably was a very difficult student, because everything he did, I said, why are you doing that? And what does that really do? So something you're all familiar with is a smoker. You would think about a beekeeper and they'd have a smoker. Now, before I had my own hives, I had done a little bit of research, and I'd been interested in the more natural ways of keeping bees, and smoking was one of those things that I wasn't quite sure about. So he was puffing away on the hive, and I was saying, why are you using smoke? And he'd say, oh, it calms the bees. So most people would go, oh, right, okay. But I went, how does it calm the bees? How does smoke calm the bees? And he said, well, they go into the hive, so they come away from the beekeeper. So you think, oh yeah, why do they go into the hive if you're puffing smoke? And he said, well, they want to fill their stomachs up with honey because they think their hive is on fire and they may need to escape. And I instantly thought, well, that's not calming. That's a stress. That's a fight or flight response. And I thought, gosh, if my house was on fire, I'd be running around trying to find photographs and trying to find bits and bobs, and I'd be really quite anxious. So that was the first thing. The second reason for using smoke is because when bees are defending their prize, which is the honey, they will sting. And when they sting, it releases a pheromone, which then tells the other bees that there's a predator. And that sting and the pheromone smells like bananas. So in the summer, if you want to avoid being stung, don't eat bananas, because the smell of bananas will attract bees and wasps possibly to attack you. So the other reason you would use smoke is to keep the bees away from you, because you're trying to mask that smell of bananas or the pheromones. So both reasons that I was given for using smoke were for the benefit of the bee, for the human, not for the bees. So I started to question things. Now, through my own health recovery, I learned that the effects of our environment were making my health really, really bad. So chemicals, toxins, bad water, food, and I thought I was quite a healthy person. I'd always been quite careful about what I ate. However, with my condition, my body wasn't very good at getting rid of stuff that it didn't need. And so any kind of toxins were stored in the tissues and then having this negative effect. And then I started to realise that when I was taking plant-based minerals, which are how we're meant to have our minerals, so those of you who are all growing into the soil and you know that you need the right minerals to have healthy plants, we are meant to eat those plants to get our minerals. So that's the plant-based minerals, because the plants are doing an incredible job processing the minerals that are deep in the soil into this healthy, nutritious form that we can absorb, and it goes straight into our cells. And so when I started taking plant-based minerals and my health improved, I started to realise that we don't have the minerals in our soil, because for years and years we've had this really intensive agricultural practice that has removed the minerals from our soil. So in 1946, if you had one plate of salad, you would receive so many nutritious vitamins and minerals. To get exactly the same nutrients now, you'd have to eat 48 plates of salad, which would be challenging for anybody, no matter how much you like salad. So I then thought, gosh, if the minerals aren't in the soil for our food, they're not in the soil for our flowers, and it's our flowers that are feeding the bees. So I started to think that perhaps our bees were getting sick because they weren't getting the minerals they needed. So it made me look at everything differently. So also it was herbal medicine that really helped get me out of the wheelchair. And I'm now 6 years healthy and 6 years into studying to be a medical herbalist. I've got another 2 to 3 years to go. It's a long, long course. But I realised that the plants have medicinal properties, and each plant has a different medicinal property. And then when I started to research more about bees, there's so many studies that show that bees, when they're sick, they will search for specific plants. They will self-medicate. So somehow the bees know which plants have nutritious components in them. So the Welsh Botanic Gardens, they've got 8,000 species of plants, and they also have bees. And they wanted to know which plants the bees went to make their honey. When they got the results back, they were astonished to find that the bees were rejecting the 8,000 exotic, beautiful blooms in their gardens, and they were choosing 11 species. They were bramble, hawthorn, elder, blackthorn, ash, willow, hazel, dandelions. It was basically all the weeds. It was everything that was outside of the gardens. So why would the bees choose the weeds other than this amazing, delicious, showy, extravaganza of botanical plants? So if we take the humble dandelion that I'm sure many of you have battled with for many a year, my father still digs up dandelions in his lawn. I'm glad he's digging them up and not pushing them up. He's not allowed to use chemicals anymore. But for 55 years, he's been digging up dandelions, and he still has a lawn full of dandelions. Where I live in Castle Carey, I moved from the town centre 17 years ago to the outskirts, and we've got a field behind our house that is grazed once a year and maybe cut once a year. 17 years ago, it was covered in dandelions. When I started keeping bees 11 years ago, it was sort of half full of dandelions. Now, last year, 2021, there were hardly any dandelions, but our gardens and our neighbours' gardens were full of dandelions. Now, nobody's been sowing them, nobody's been digging them up, nobody's been spraying them. So what was this movement? So I started to try and find out more about dandelions. And this is what I love, is how the minerals, the herbal medicine and the bees, they're all connected. They're all connected by the bees. So a dandelion has really deep tap roots. They go down into the soil, as I'm sure you're all aware. And the reason for that is because they're searching for the calcium and potassium. And they break down the calcium and potassium and they process it and they're digesting it so that the plant-based form of those minerals is in the leaves. So if you eat dandelion leaves, you're going to have easily absorbable calcium and potassium. Now, if you leave the dandelions on your lawn, that calcium and potassium in an absorbable form is restored to the top of the soil. So you're mineralizing the top of your soil. Now, this is where it's absolutely incredible. The seeds of a dandelion head. Now, I only learnt today that they can be taken up to 60 miles by wind. So all your digging is completely pointless, because if somebody 60 miles away has kids blowing them, you know, there's a good chance you're still going to have dandelions. But those seeds, they will only take root in soil that needs calcium and potassium. So when the soil is rebalanced, those dandelions will move on, which is what's happened in the field behind us. And because they haven't been allowed to do their work in my dad's garden and his lawn, they're still there. So that's just dandelions. Think about all the other plants, all the other weeds, and just think about how they're all correcting the soil. They all have a purpose. So there's this difference between wilding and rewilding. We have as this human idea that we know best and that we're going to plant things that we think are best for that soil. So a classic example between the difference of rewilding and wilding is you might have a large field and you might look through your history books and find that 500 years ago it was an oak forest. So you want to restore it to the wild, so you'll plant an oak forest. However, you may not be realising that 500 years ago oak forests were planted because Queen Elizabeth realised that it was unsustainable using 2,500 oak trees per battleship to build a battleship. So they had to clear other land and plant oak forests. So for thousands of years, humans have been putting their perspective of what we need on the soil. And for 150 million years, bees have been doing their best to reset the balance. So everything about bees is about survival of the species, survival of their colonies, and survival of the planet. And so the bees are always searching for the nutrient-rich food, for the flowers and the plants that they really need to actually give them the health that they need to survive. So we've all heard that the bees are dying out. You know, the bees, you know, they're endangered. So what can we do to save the bees? So does anyone know how many species of bees there actually are? No? Any ideas?
In the UK, about 500.
No. So in the world, there's 22,000 species of bees. So a little bit out, but you weren't too far out for Britain. So there's 22,000 species of bees. So that's the solitary bees, bumblebees, and honeybees. There's 11 species of honeybees around the world. Now here in the UK, we have 270 species of bees and only one honeybee. So those 269 species of bees that we have left, we've lost 40 species in the last 50 years. They are the main pollinators. And they are the main pollinators because they're fluffy. So their job is to pollinate. So the big fat fluffy bumblebees, they're covered in hairs, which as soon as they go near to a plant, they're attracting all the pollen. And so when they go to another plant, they distribute more pollen. So they are the real effective pollinators. So the apple trees that we have all around us here, the main pollinator of apple trees is a bee called the red mason bee. So the red mason bee has a red fluffy stomach. I've got this this chart here is really good. It's only got 27 of the species of bees in Britain, but the red mason bee, there we go, is that one there. I'll pass this round so you can have a look. So you might at first glance think, oh, it looks like a honeybee, but actually the honeybee, which is on the other page, has almost a smooth abdomen. It isn't all hairy and fluffy, whereas the red mason bee is hairy and fluffy. And it's that fluffy hair that attracts the pollen. And one red mason bee will do the pollination work of 250 honeybees. So why are the bees under threat? So if we look at California, where 80% of the world's almonds are grown, they have 1 million acres of almond trees. And those almond trees are sprayed, the soil is treated with all kinds of fungicide. There's just such a toxic environment there. Now in North America, there should be 4,000 species of solitary and bumblebees. But in this region of California, none of those bees can survive. And so that's why they have to have honeybees brought in on trucks to pollinate those almonds. So we get used to thinking, oh, that's how our honey is made, is by seeing these great big trucks with hundreds of thousands of colonies of bees driven all the way around America. So they start with the almonds, then they'll be doing cherry blossom, they'll do blueberries, cranberries, pears, apples, and their whole lives are spent being driven around the States. And it isn't just America, this is all around the world, this is happening. And it's happening more and more because the environment is destroying those solitary bees. And because we don't take honey from those solitary bees, nobody cares when they die. But some of those bees are connected to just one species, one plant. And so if you lose the bee, you lose that plant. If you lose that plant, you lose the bee. So it's really important that we have and we encourage that biodiversity. So as gardeners, it's really important that you can start looking at your environment and thinking, how bee friendly is it? Now, almost every day people say to me, oh, I really want to save the bees. I'm thinking of having a beehive. And that seems to be our first response. And I was the same. I just knew something needed to be done with bees, and having a beehive seemed the right thing to do. And I was lucky that it was a local beekeeper who put his bees into my hive. But what normally happens is you get a beehive, you join your beekeeping group, and then you order a packet of bees. And quite often those bees come from abroad. They come from Italy, or they come from Denmark, or they come where bees are bred. And the bees are bred for human benefit. Honeybees are bred to produce more honey, to be less aggressive, so they're not going to sting you as much, to not produce propolis, because the propolis sticks the hive together. And all these things might be great for humans and for honey production, but they're not very good for the bees. And so what's happening is those bees are becoming weaker and weaker, and then more and more susceptible to disease. So what do humans do? They then drench the hive with chemicals to kill the mites, to kill the disease. But as Joe has often said, if you use chemicals in a hive to destroy a mite called varroa, if one varroa mite survives, you've now bred a chemical resistant varroa mite. Now imagine how big and tough that is. So for, 25, 30 years, there's been chemicals used in hives. How long is it, Joe? Yeah. And we still have varroa. And yet our bees are getting sicker and sicker. Now, the other thing about buying in a package of bees is those bees will expand to be 50,000 in the summer, sometimes even more. You could have a big hive with 70 or 80,000 bees. Now, all those bees need feeding, and they will fly in a 5-mile radius around their home. Now, if you think of all these solitary bees, these beautiful, peaceful, fluffy, cute bees that we've got in our gardens, and somebody puts in 50,000 hungry bees next door, they're going to starve out all the native bees. So this is what's happening. So the biggest risk to bees is beekeepers. And this is why we have to change. The second biggest risk is chemicals. And some of the biggest users of chemicals are gardeners. So think of all those chemicals that you've got that you might think you're going to spray on bits that don't quite look nice, or you think they need a bit of a boost. It all has a consequence. Now, if you think of all the chemicals that are sprayed and on the soil and on the actual blossoms of almonds that are killing the bees, 40% of bees that pollinate almonds die. You know, that's the expected losses of bees from just one crop. So what happens to people that eat those almonds? Can you really tell me that those chemicals are not having any effect on us? Now, when they test the chemicals, have you all heard of neonicotinoids?
Yeah.
Okay, really dangerous, awful chemicals. Now, they are made of 3 neonicotinoids and combined with 2 fungicides. Now, when they test them, what they do is they have a petri dish with a bee in it, and they'll do droppers of one of the neonics at a time. They'll test that neonic. When 50% of the bees in the petri dish survive, it's safe. Then they'll test the next one. When 50% of those survive, it's safe. They never test all 5 ingredients together. Now, if any of you remember a book called Silent Spring that came out in 1963, very powerful book. And she was a biologist. I've just forgotten her name. Is it Rachel Carson? That's it. So Rachel Carson was a biologist, and she studied the effects of DDT, and it's due to her that DDT got banned. But it was her life's work. I mean, she died shortly after her book was published. But what they found was when they sprayed DDT in perhaps 1 part per million over a lake to kill the mosquitoes, the first year they got rid of all the mosquitoes. So everyone was like, yeah, it's worked. The second year, dead fish started popping up. The third year, there were dead birds. The fourth year, there were dead deer. There were dead squirrels. All kinds of other bears. All different other mammals were dying. Now, each time that they did autopsies on those animals and fish through the food chain, the parts per million increased. So the chemicals, what happens, the toxins are stored in the tissues, and as the next thing along the food chain eats them, the parts per million increases. And this is why when people suddenly lose weight, they get very sick, because all the toxins that you've collected in your life are stored in your tissues. And when you lose weight, or in your fat, and when you lose weight, all those toxins are released into the body. So saving the bees isn't just about saving the bees. It's about saving all of us and saving the planet. Now, I travelled to Bhutan back in 2018 because I was really intrigued to see a country where the bees were healthy, where the people were healthy and happy. They judged their success as a country not by GDP, but by gross national happiness. And there they don't use chemicals. The king of Bhutan declared that all the land should be organic, no chemicals used in their agriculture. And there's still a lot of small farm holdings, and so it's subsistence farming. And the bees are doing really well there, really, really well. And when I asked them what percentage of bees were dying over winter, they sort of looked at me a bit puzzled, and they chatted a bit. And then one of them said, so-and-so lost a bee, or lost a colony of bees about 4 years ago. I think it was a bear. So they're not losing the bees. And here we've got used to having 10%, 20% losses every year because of our environment. And we're blaming it on, well, that's normal. We're accepting it, but it isn't normal. Bees are meant to be surviving. So when I was asked to go up to the Newt when they first opened, I was really, really lucky. And it was a pure chance. I had a stand at Castle Carey Market, so I'd only been well for about a year. And I had a few jars of my honey, but I was very protective of it. And I had some herbal teas that I was mixing, and I had beeswax candles. And my husband was making cider as a hobby, and I'd had enough of it being all around our living room. So I said, right, we've got to start selling this. So I had a little stand, and then the owner of the Newt, who I didn't know who he was, so this is 2017, he came onto my market stand and he wanted to buy some honey. And I had my honey under the counter, and I said, well, I only sell it to locals. And he didn't look very local to me. And I said, so where do you live? And he said, oh, I live in Hadspun. I went, oh, that's a nice little village. I said, I've got friends in Hadspun. Whereabouts in Hadspun are you? And he said, the house. So then I was like, oh, I've heard all about you. And he said, oh, all bad, I expect. And I said, no, just little mutterings and rumours. So he said, well, I've planted a little orchard and I'm thinking about having some bees. Would you come and have a look? So I agreed to go and have a look. And by the time I'd got home from the market, there was an email saying, lovely to meet you today, Paula. Will you come up and have a look on Monday? So I went there and I had a tour with Tia. Do some of you remember Tia, who was the head gardener there? And she'd been there for years and years and years. She's now got Wild Garden in Galhampton. And Katie, who was the architect. And they gave me a tour of all the mud and all the woodland and everything overgrown and all the building site. And they told me what they were planning to do at the Newt. They said, we're going to have this hotel, we're going to have visitor gardens, and we'd really like bees. What do you think we could do? So I came home and I thought, gosh, this is a real opportunity. And I had nothing to lose. So I wrote a 26-page document on everything I would do if it was mine and if money was no object. And I wrote that and emailed it in and just thought, well, I'll see what happens. Within about 24 hours, I had an email back saying, great, will you do it? So amazingly, the bees had introduced me to Joe. So whilst I was writing that document, I'd gone to a swarm talk in Somerton, and I sat near the front, and it was a lovely, lovely beekeeper who's from Buckfast Abbey, Claire Densley, and she was talking about swarms. Now, I was already aware that most conventional beekeepers, they don't like swarms. They want to clip the wings of the queen, stop them swarming, keep the bees in the hive so you keep the honey. Swarming is a sign of health of a colony. It's natural. It's how the bees expand. So I was really ready to be the odd one out who was like going to sit there and think, I don't like what she's saying. And because Claire Densley was from Buckfast Abbey, where Brother Adam is, the father of queen breeding and of making bees the best they can be for humans, not for bees. But interestingly, Claire has bucked the trend and she was pro-swarming. So instead of me sat there with my arms folded, and I was sat next to Joe, and soon found out that Joe was a natural beekeeper as well, we were the ones that were applauding her and so excited, whilst there were lots of mutterings and folded arms all around us. So Joe and I exchanged details. And then when I next went to the Newt, and they said, or it was then Emily Estate, and they said, do you need some help? And I said, well, yes, I will need some help to do this. And they said, well, have you got anybody in mind? And I said, well, funnily enough, I met a local beekeeper just the other day, and I think he'd be just right. And so I said, his name's Joe. And Tia already knew Joe because he'd been checking on the bees that they had up there. So when I joined in 2017, they had one colony that was a swarm that had flown into a worry hive, and they had one wild colony that was still living in a tree. And now we've got between 15 and 20 colonies, but we haven't brought in any queens. We haven't brought in any bees. We don't feed them sugar. We don't use smoke, and we allow them to swarm. And we've got healthy bees. We don't use any chemicals. We've been able to film the bees grooming each other, getting rid of varroa mites. So all the things that you're told don't happen, can't be done, and they can. So we're so lucky to have the opportunity to do something completely different and very controversial in the bee world, because to go against the grain, to go against what science has told us we all need to do, we are bucking the trend. But each year we increase our colonies instead of lowering our colonies. And what we're hoping is that what we can do here is show that we can have sustainable beekeeping, but also I'm having to fight with all the gardeners, with all the growers, everybody up at the Newt to say, no, you can't be using glyphosate. You can't be spraying this. My husband is now making cider up at the Newt, so he's in charge of the orchards. So he doesn't get any hot dinners if he does anything nasty to those trees. So we're having to work together to find, it's not always an easy path, but it's finding the way that is sustainable and the way to give us all a future for ourselves, for our children and for our grandchildren. So it all comes down to education, because many of us don't know about bees until bees come into our lives. Many of us don't know about minerals until you need them or until you get sick because you don't have enough minerals. So what I'm on a mission to do is inspire people to start asking questions, to start thinking differently, and to start looking at, how do we grow our garden? Why do we look at weeds as if they are, dreadful, dreadful things? And yet dandelions are some of the most powerful natural herbal medicines. The roots have been shown to reduce cancerous tumours. They're rich in minerals. They cleanse the kidney and the liver. They're so supportive. They're free medicine. So why on earth would we be killing them? You know, it doesn't make sense. So I'm just trying to share what I've learned about bees and to give us all that opportunity to have health, looking through what we eat, what we grow, what we surround ourselves with. And I think the real special gift is honey. And I've brought some honey along and I've got some testers. So I don't know how you feel about having honey passed around and dipping a stick into a jar. If you'd like to, I'm happy for you to do it. Honey is pretty, you know, antibacterial, anti-everything. It's good stuff. So I'll pass this around. So this first one, so take a stick. Obviously no double dipping, no putting your fingers in. Try not to cough in the jar. You're all adults. So sweet chestnut, you would think would be a sweet honey. Or do we need strong wrists? So just have it, when you taste a honey, just put the stick in and just scoop up a little drop, put it on your tongue, and then roll your tongue across the roof of your mouth. And what you'll find is you'll release the flavours. Now, this is a really good sweet chestnut. Now, some sweet chestnuts are really bitter. This isn't the bitterest honey in the world, it's the second bitterest honey in the world. But have a taste and see what you think. Now, what I'm trying to do is raise our awareness of single variety honeys, because the bees know that honeys have different medicinal properties. So here I've got Niuli. Now, this is different again. So you can use the other end of the stick. That is an amazing honey. That comes from Spain, and it's organic. So it means that the forests where those bees are foraging, there's no chemicals used. It's completely wild forests. And then this next one is Niuli, which is a medicinal tree in Madagascar. So this again is organic, there's no chemicals used. The Niuli tree has been used by the Malagasy people as medicine for thousands of years. They use the fruit, they use the bark, they use the roots, the leaves, the flowers, everything, and they use it for all different things. They use this honey to heal skin. They give it to their babies to help them sleep, to soothe the babies. They also use it on the baby's skin for nappy rash. So, you know, they use honey for everything. And honey is the medicine. Oh, I forgot to tell you, in Bhutan, the real amazing nugget that I came away with was that the Buddhist monks in Bhutan believe that the highest level of reincarnation is as a bee. So the Buddhists see the bees as the wisdom. And a couple of weeks ago, I was sat next to a Muslim chap who's actually a naturopathic doctor. And we were talking about naturopathy, because I call my form of beekeeping naturopathic beekeeping, because I'm working in alignment with nature. And he was Muslim, and he was saying, oh, did you know there's a chapter in the Quran called the bee, which I did know. And there's an amazing bit which I quote in my book, which says about you're told to put hives in the mountains, in the trees, and where the bees choose, and from their bellies emerges fluid of different colours, which is healing for the people. Then it says, surely in that is a sign for those who reflect. So in the Quran, it says that the different coloured honeys are different forms of healing for people. So what makes the different colours? It's the different plants. So the bees want that diversity. So now to soothe your palates, I've got a lovely honey. This is from the Lake District. And this is actually a blend. So this is from their bees. They've got heather honey, and then they have wildflower blossom honey. And they've actually mixed it to our recipe. It was Randy and my recipe, actually. We had jars of both of the honeys, and we were mixing them together to find just the right blend. Because for some people, the heather honey is a bit too harsh. And so softening it with the blend. So you'll find this will be much more fun. Oh, you need more sticks. Some more sticks. I'll come around again.
Yeah, thank you very much. She said she would go with it. Can I give you sticks?
So what I'm trying to do at the Newt is, instead of taking all the honey, you know, taking a big box of honey in one go and mixing it all up together. So then the honey, the newt honey, would be flowers that the bees have taken all season. What we're doing is taking individual frames throughout the year, or even if we do take a large quantity from one colony, we are then only spinning them in 2s or 3s and detecting what the floral varieties are. So I was lucky enough to go to Bologna and study, it's been over the last 4 years, but I've gone there 3 times now to study to be a honey sensory analyst, so that I can detect the different floral varieties from taste. Because there's so much fraud in honey. There's more honey sold in the world than is produced. So that gives you an idea that a lot of the honey that you're buying is not even honey.
I was wondering that. So what is it?
It's sugar syrup, it's rice syrup. They're getting very, very clever. Now, the other thing that happens in Britain and in the EU and in North America, you're only allowed to sell honey from the bee Apis mellifera. Now, you know I said there was 11 species of honeybees. Well, on the cover of this book, this bee is Apis laboriosa, or the Asian giant honeybee. And this bee only lives over 3,000 meters altitude. Then there's another giant honeybee, which is called the Apis dorsata. So you might have seen on television where people are sort of on rope ladders with smoke and they're just cutting away the hives. I think using smoke then is fine. You know, that's acceptable. But the honey from them is really, really special. I mean, this is wild bees in the Himalayas. There's no chemicals. It's, you know, it should be sustainably produced, but unfortunately tourism is affecting that. Now, that honey would be harvested once a year. It's very, very precious. But because there's no global market for it, the communities who have this honey are ripped off by big honey dealers who will go round and they'll buy this honey literally for peanuts, because these are indigenous people, these are small communities who don't appreciate the true value of their honey. And then it is mixed in big drums with sugar syrup, with perhaps some Apis mellifera honey, other bee species of honey. And then it's all shipped around the world, and only 1 in 100 barrels would ever get tested. And then they're even getting really clever that they will add pollen to a sugar syrup so that when it's put under a microscope, it looks like it's honey. There is so much fraud and corruption. But it's all down to what we buy. And if we keep demanding cheap honey from supermarkets, that's what you're going to get. You're going to be encouraging this, this whole practice. So as a rule of thumb, I would say that if it's less than £5 a jar, and I don't care if it's a little jar or a big jar, if it's less than £5, it's not honey, because it's not sustainable to sell honey for that price. The only exception is if you'd had a beekeeper who's been selling honey from his garage for £3.50 for the last 40 years and hasn't caught up with inflation. Mm-hmm. But if it's in a supermarket, or if it's in a shop, if it's less than £5 a jar, it can't be honey. And even if somebody swore it was honey, what they've done is they have taken honey from beekeepers and not paid them a fair wage. So the Madagascar honey, every jar of honey that's sold plants a tree in Madagascar. When you buy honey from them, it's supporting 350 beekeepers across Madagascar. Selling their honey gives them a regular income, and it sends their children to school. It puts roofs on the buildings. You know, if you're buying honey from a supermarket, all you're doing is putting money into shareholders' pockets. So really consider, and it's that power of the pound. And if you really want to save the bee, you've got to stop buying food that's grown with chemicals. And it might be a big leap to go suddenly completely organic, but just think of the little things. Start thinking about potatoes, start growing your own, and just think about the impact, because the more people who buy chemical-free food, that is going to change the global agriculture. It will completely transform it. And even if you still want to buy almonds from California that are sprayed with chemicals and killing bees, just share the story and start informing other people. Buy less of them, or buy them from places like Israel or Spain where they're organically grown, or even some of the new organic farmers in California who are trying to buck the trend. So it's being really aware of where our food comes from, because you can't tell me that these things will kill the bees and not harm us. And when you look at how sick humanity is and how sick bees are and how sick our environment is, we cannot keep going with putting all these chemicals into the soil, into our bodies, into nature, without having some kind of consequence. And so it's when you start asking questions at the garden centre, when you buy a pot plant, you say, was this grown with neonicotinoids? Has this been sprayed? And if it has, leave it on the shelf, because the more people who ask these questions, the more it's going to change the garden centres. At the moment, it's a dirty secret because nobody asks the questions. So, you know, be the warriors, go out there and let's just change the world, because there are 7 billion of us. And it's these little differences that we make that has a huge impact. So there's no point waiting for a government to change or waiting for a king to say, let's all go organic. Let's just do it from the choice of ourselves. So it can be from the seeds that you sow to the plants that you buy or the food that you eat. So I could probably talk for days about bees and honey, but if any of you got any questions, is there anything you would particularly like to know? Yes.
Do you take honey off the hives in the nude? And if so, how do you make sure that you're not stung them?
Right, so what we do, we do take honey, but not from all the bees. Now, when I first suggested, particularly to Joe, that this is what we do, he smiled very sweetly, but I know he thought I was a complete nutter. So what I do, and I'll tell you the first story. So the bees in my garden, when I would take honey from them, I would spend a lot of time with them and I would just get a feeling about, I would ask them, in my head, I would be by my hives and I'd say, how much honey can we have? And I'd get a feeling. It might be 6 frames, it might be 10 frames, it might be a box, it might be 20 frames. And there was this one particular time where, because I was still not that able, my husband would help me. So we'd put newspaper all around the kitchen. We'd got all the kit into the kitchen. You know, we had overalls on and we were all set. And he said, right, you go out and get the honey. And I had a feeling that I could have 6 frames. So I took 6 frames from my bees, brought them into the house. You know, we've got a spin extractor. So my husband was, you know, spinning it like mad. And we did the 6 frames and he said, oh, this is lovely, this is so good. And I just happened to mention, well, when I took the 6 frames out, and I didn't use clearing boards, I didn't use smoke, I just literally pulled them out, blew off, shook off the bees, put them in a separate box, brought it in the kitchen, and had about 20, 30 bees come in the kitchen. You open the windows, they fly out, fine, nobody stung, no trouble. And I just mentioned to my husband, I said, oh, when I took these frames out, there was loads of honey in there. I could have had more. And he said, well, we've got all this stuff out, go and get some more. And I was like, I don't know, but I thought, okay. And so I took the frames that we'd spun. So once you've spun them and you've taken the honey out, it's called a wet frame. You put it back in the hive so the bees can lick up all the last drops of honey and then they can fill it up again. So I put in those 6 and I said, well, girls, Gregory said that, you know, we've got everything out. Can we have another 2 frames? And I heard the pitch of the buzz change. They sort of went from to So I thought, well, I better be quick. So I put in the 6, took out another 2, went back to the kitchen. This time I had about 150 bees follow me back. Now we'd had the windows open because when we did the first extraction, they were all chilled out and they could just fly out. When we had the windows open, the other 30,000 bees decided to come straight into the kitchen. We were completely covered, and we had all the doors and windows open in the house because it's always the hottest days when you're doing this. And in our living room, we've actually got a roof light, you know, where it's sort of like an orangery light, which only had 2 little bits that open. So of course the bees are hurtling trying to get out and they can't. So I was up on a ladder for about 4 hours, just scooping up every little bee and trying to get them outside. So they weren't pleased. We didn't get stung, but they were very angry. And that really taught me that I'd broken my agreement. They'd said to me I could have 6 frames. I'd taken 6 and I'd gone back and got another 2. So when I was at the Newt, I said, well, Joe, this is how we're going to do it. So what we do is I sit quietly with them about a week before and I say, right, girls, next Tuesday, it's rent day. You know, we've worked really hard to make sure that the Newt use the minimal chemicals or no chemicals at all. We've really looked after you. We've told everybody how wonderful you are. We're trying to get everyone to do it without chemicals like we are. So it's rent day. Now you need to share with us some of your honey. How much can we have? And I get a feeling. And all of us have got our favourite hives. So now all of us sit with different hives and we just write in a notebook and we go, well, we think Winifred said 10 this time. And we think Sylvia said 4 and Alison said 2. And, you know, we go through this with all the hives. So then when we come to take the honey, we actually spray ourselves with lavender water. We don't use the smoke. And it's a slow process. So we take off all the supers and we put them right next to the hive. And we haven't used clearing boards. And what we do, instead of taking the latest harvest from the top, we go through all the boxes. So some of the hives, like Winifred's, very productive, so named after Joe's granddaughter, feisty Winnie, in both forms, bee and granddaughter. And so we take out each frame, and the frames with no bees on are the capped frames with the honey, and we put them in a separate box. So then we take a selection and we give back the bees a selection and we reorganise it, put it back in. Now it can take 2 hours to do 4 hives, but none of us get stung. Now, interestingly, this week in a beekeeping group on Facebook, I put a little poll in because I hadn't really done a poll before, and I thought it'd be interesting to know. And I put, when you're extracting honey or honey harvest, how many times do you expect to be stung? And I put options like 3 to 10, 3 to 10 stings, you know, none at all. And then I did all these different options. And what was really interesting was I had over 100 people respond. So it was, you know, quite high. And about 30% of them have between 3 and 10 stings. And there was only a tiny minority that have no stings at all. So people have got used to taking honey from the bees and being stung and thinking that's normal. But the bees are only stinging you because you're taking from them what isn't yours to take. You know, sometimes you do get stung if you squash one by accident or you're in the way. But bees don't want to sting you because they die. So if you keep going to the hive and getting stung all over and everybody in your garden and all your neighbours are getting stung, then something isn't right. So this is what we need to do, is connect again with nature. And I know when I first was telling my husband this, he said, don't tell anyone that, they'll think you're mad, you know. And I tell, when I do the bee safaris, I tell everybody this now. And more people are going, oh, that makes sense. And more beekeepers are doing it and going, yeah, I talk to my bees. Yes, I listen to my bees. That's the key thing, listening to your bees. But that connection with nature, that intuition of how many, that's our gut instinct, that's our intuition. Now that is how plants communicate with bees. So when a flower is blooming and it wants pollinating and it's got the nectar, it sends out this electrical frequency, sends out a wave. Now when the bees are flying, they have a positive electrical charge and the flowers have a negative electrical charge. So they're pulled together like magnets. When the bee lands on that flower, it changes the polarity of that flower. So the next bee knows that that flower has been pollinated. Now the trees, underneath the trees, all the roots are connected underground and coated in mycelia. And the trees are sending messages, electrical messages through the mycelia. Now the middle-aged woman like me, although she was a professor, when she first published a paper saying this, they all thought she was mad. So mad that so many scientists redid her test to prove her wrong, that it then became proven that she was right. So it's now accepted science that the largest living organism in the world is the mycelia coating the roots of trees in North America. It's also the oldest living organism at over 4,000 years old. So everything in nature is communicating and talking to each other. And I believe that our intuition is when we are connecting to that worldwide web. It's the nature's intuition. And actually, I've got one other little thing which really confirms that. In my herbal medicine studies, I had to write an essay about the history of herbal medicine. And there was a chapter in my textbook about the first settlers to America and how, because it wasn't economically viable, the physicians and the apothecaries didn't go in the first waves because there was no business to be had when they got there. So the settlers were dependent on the wise women, who they then later burnt. But the wise women had the knowledge of the herbs and the knowledge of the medicines. So they took herbs with them. And something like plantain was called by the Native Americans white man's footprint, because the plantain seeds were going ahead of the settlers and then coming up, and the Native Americans could see the white man was coming. Now, in all the records of the first interactions, the Native Americans were recorded as being fit and strong with straight teeth and really, really healthy. And so people saying, well, how are you so healthy? And where's your medicine? And they would always say, it's the plants, it's, you know, it's the trees, it's all around us. Everything is medicine, and that's what we're using. Now, in one recount, there was an article about somebody who had a deeper relationship, and it was a community that actually survived because they really connected well with the Native Americans. And they asked, so how do you know which plants are medicinal? And the response was, they tell us, which to many people confirmed that they were savages, and therefore all their medicine was to be ignored. But to the people that survived, they took their wisdom and they trusted that the plants were talking to the Native Americans. Now, who of you in your garden doesn't talk to your roses, doesn't talk to your plants? And how many of you sometimes feel they talk back? And that is when we are connected with nature. And that's when we are real humans. And instead of being separate from nature and the world we live in, we are part of it. And so what I'm calling more people to do is actually listen to our intuition and really connect with nature again, because that's where all the answers are.
Did you see David Attenborough last night on Green Planet?
No, I didn't, but he was talking about weeds,
See it,
wasn't he?
because he was saying every tree is connected to another tree.
Yeah,
All the mycelia in it.
it is.
And it is well worth watching.
I will. No, I'll dig that out. But the saddest thing to me now, since knowing that, is when you see a solitary tree in the middle of a field, when you know that they're spraying fungicide and chemicals all around it, and you just think, how sad. And the thing is, with an oak tree, it will spend 300 years growing, 300 years stable, and 300 years dying. So we can be witnessing its last 300 years. Or we could be speeding it up, you know. Yeah, everything is connected. And the bees are here to teach us that. So we have to start listening.
Any more questions?
Actually, I've got one. My wife swears by the remedial beneficial effects of Manuka honey.
Ah, yes.
And I'm always slightly worried about it being sustainable, because you know it's all been copied now in sorts. So is there something else, you know, perhaps she should or myself look at?
Dandelion honey.
Oh, okay.
That would be the best. Yeah, Manuka honey was the first and possibly the only honey to be tested to the extent it was. And the reason was that the Maori were using the Manuka honey. So Manuka is a tea tree plant that grows wild all across New Zealand. And the Maori would take the bees to feed on it, or the bees would feed on it. And they knew that the honey it produced was medicinal. So they would be eating the honey. Now, in the 1980s, the government were trying to help these rural communities with economic development. And they were trying to find crafts they could do and products they could sell. And they said, why don't you sell more of your honey? And they said, well, the tourists don't like the taste. And the government was saying, yeah, but you know it's medicinal. So they said, yeah, but we can't prove it. So then what happened was you had about 150 beekeepers across all of New Zealand supplied honey, and the government paid for it all to be tested. Now, if I was to try and get dandelion honey to be tested to that extent, I'd have to find 149 other beekeepers in this region. We'd all have to have pure dandelion honey, and we'd have to have funding from the government to pay for that kind of expensive tests. So yes, Manuka honey is medicinal because the tea tree plant is medicinal, but you have different levels of medicine. The wild Manuka growing in New Zealand is very different to the Manuka grown in polytunnels in China, where the bees are trapped in a polytunnel to forage on the Manuka to get that high MGO. So we're in this situation where you just have one honey saying that only one plant is medicinal. The Niuli honey from Madagascar, they've actually had tests done which have shown it has medicinal properties. So there's now more and more honeys coming forward, but it takes a lot of money to prove that. Now, if medical herbalists have been using thousands of plants for thousands of years, and if the bees are choosing to feed off different plants when they have different ailments, so they are self-medicating from plants, then surely, and even in the Quran, it says, you know, from their bellies emerges a fluid of different colours which is healing for the people. So what I would suggest is when you look at honeys, when you can see a great range of honeys, go for what your intuition tells you, whether it's the name of the plant, the name of the flower, or the name, or even the colour. If you feel attracted to a dark honey or a light honey or a crystallized honey or a creamy honey, and actually go for that, because that will be the medicine for you. And what we have to understand is our bodies are changing all the time. Nature's changing all the time. So what could be wonderful medicine for you now might not be wonderful medicine next week. So it's always listening to our bodies and listening to the environment around us and changing and adapting. So yeah, I would say, you know, go with your gut instinct. But good Manuka honey from a good source in New Zealand is really, really good. And it has different chemical makeup to other plants' honeys. So other honeys produce hydrogen peroxide when they're in touch with water, which kills bacteria. So that's why honey is antibacterial. But the Manuka honey actually has MgO in it, which is methyl glyoxal, and it's produced by the photosynthesis of the plant growing in its location. Now, if you heat a normal honey, you will produce methyl glyoxal, but in a toxic form. So you should never really cook with honey. So it's really interesting that if you try and produce a chemical one way, it can be toxic, but if it's produced naturally, it isn't. So yeah, there could be a whole book written about, you know, well, there are many books written about honey, but just about, you know, Manuka honey. But I think the best medicine for us in Britain would be dandelion honey, but you have to stop poisoning the dandelions.
Is it possible to get dandelion honey?
Well, we had about 30 mini jars at the Newt in 2019, which I just use for tasting when we do honey tastings up there. And in recent years, what we've had is laurel honey, we've had lime tree honey, we've had bramble honey. Can you think of other ones we've had?
Towards the end of the year, I think this year I might be able to get some ivy honey.
Oh, yeah, that's
Very
good
strong
stuff.
stuff. But I gave some to a girl who had a horse that had an ulcer that couldn't be healed, and she tried a pot of it, and it was cured within 2 weeks. And that was ivy honey.
Yeah, honey's amazing stuff. Amazing. So, you know, if you get poorly, if you get the Rona or a bit of a flu or something, just stay in bed with a nice pot of honey, that sweet chestnut or a holm oak honey, a nice dark honey, and just eat honey. You'd be fine.
I shall remember that next time. Paula, thank you so much for giving us such an amazing insight to beekeeping and ourselves and how we should be matching the two together.
Thank you.
Very, very much indeed.
Thank you.